behalf of the Governor State University sponsors of this evening's book panel and discussion on public scholarship in the humanities, I'm delighted to welcome Christopher Douglas, Professor of English at the University of Victoria, Canada. His chapter in Public Scholarship and Literary Studies, entitled Public Scholarship in the Age of the Christian Right, a Self-Interested Tale, is a testament to how knowledge that might appear arcane and of interest only to readers of university press monographs is, in fact, timely and valuable for a much broader audience. The specialist knowledge and disciplinary training that inform his Cornell University Press book, If God Meant to Interfere, American Literature and the Rise of the Christian Right, also informs the pieces he has written for what we might call a readership of educated citizens. His public scholarship on the intersections of literature, religion, and US politics has appeared in Religion Dispatches, Marginalia, and The Conversation. His essay on the religious origins of fake news was shared over 17,000 times and was later commissioned by the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies for development and presentation to its policy network for Western diplomats. In his presentation this evening, he will take us through the story of how he got started in public scholarship, sharing examples and strategies. I'll turn it over to him now.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to the Dean and the President for the wonderful introductions, and to Professors Johnson and Artiega for including me in this book. And I'm happy to see that it's going to come out sometime next month. So I'm going to talk briefly about why I started doing public scholarship in literary studies. You'll soon discover my high-minded and altruistic motives. I'm going to give a few examples of what I've done and then talk about sort of the hows and whys of public scholarship. So why do public scholarship in literary studies? My first foray into public scholarship was really motivated by what we might just have to admit was brazen, shameless self-promotion. I just published a book that seemed timely, If God Meant to Interfere, American Literature and the Rise of the Christian Right. And I wanted to see if I could promote the book to a potentially wider audience beyond English professors and academics. The book's argument basically was that since the 1970s, the unexpected political reemergence of the Christian right has sort of been the background, crucial context, though sometimes an invisible one, for religiously interested US fiction in the last half century or so. The argument involved reading some novels that were obviously responding to Christian fundamentalism and its politics, like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale or Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, but it also involved kind of rereading other texts that spoke to the resurgence in a roundabout way or by indirect address. Novels like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian or Marilynne Robinson's Gilead, or even Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. The book seemed timely when it was published in the spring of 2016 during the election. The Christian right didn't seem to be disappearing as some prognosticators had envisioned. Instead, it was slowly but resolutely coalescing around what seemed like an unlikely hero, Donald J. Trump. So my first foray was to sort of write small snippets out of the book for public scholarship. And on this occasion, for instance, this was the first time a sitting president had interviewed a living author. And so I talked in this piece about the sort of mutual admiration between Marilynne Robinson and Barack Obama, and their shared idealization of the history of Midwest abolitionism. When the evangelical best-selling novel The Shack came out and was made into a movie, I wrote a piece on how it was kind of like a 21st century revision of the Book of Job. As we moved into the Trump presidency, some pieces I wrote sort of focused on how contemporary religiously interested literature sort of commented on religious dynamics that were happening in the American present. So Roth's vision of Christian authoritarianism and indeed fascism was written during the George W. Bush presidency, but I sort of tried to see how it would map on to the contemporary period in 2017. Another example was Hulu's adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale. What Hulu did in a really worthy attempt to diversify the cast was that they made the narrator's husband and friend into best friend into African-American characters. The problem was that the dystopian Gilead, as you might remember, was a white ethno state. So the show risked sort of becoming a dystopian Friends. So this worthy change meant all the less that they were jettisoning Margaret Atwood's critique of Christian right history in Christian segregationism and Christian slavery before that. The Handmaid's Tale had been based on narratives by enslaved African Americans. That was the sort of basis for the genre. And so Atwood's attention to the history of the Christian right, to racism, power, very important for contemplating the Trump era, risked getting sort of left aside in the Hulu adaptation. In a follow-up piece, I argued that Atwood had kind of misperceived the willingness of the Christian right to work within American democratic and mythological structures. I published this 3 years ago, and I'm not any longer confident in this argument in 2021, following years of conservative white Christian authoritarian voter suppression and anti-democratic agitation, culminating in the failed January 6th insurrection in your country. I want to talk a little bit about the pitch and the occasion for a piece of public scholarship. This is the page from the Conversations pitch page. The Conversation is a great venue for academics thinking about trying to reach a broader audience. Depending on the venue, you're trying to write a piece that's probably about 700 to 2,000 words. This is way smaller than an academic article. It also has sort of a different format. It starts with the sort of biggest idea first, and then sort of moves down into kind of details and analysis. That was hard for me to learn. Editors and outlets want to know what the occasion is for the piece that you're proposing to them in a pitch. So why is the author talking about this idea at this time? Editors are asking this question from the potential audience's point of view. If a potential reader comes across the title of your piece on a homepage or on social media, what is going to get the reader to click on the link and read the piece and hopefully share it with their own networks? So for instance, I wrote a piece on Carl Sagan's Contact. This also was from my book, repurposed here. And the occasion was the 20th anniversary of the film adaptation of the novel, even though my piece itself was mostly on the novel. So this was a bit of a, shall we say, flimsy occasion. Another piece that I wrote was on the rumored, much rumored but never occurring film adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. This was also from my book, also repurposed, and also kind of flimsy because it was on this, this adaptation that just kept never appearing. So I think the lesson here is to be creative when trying to think about why something is timely or relevant. As literary scholars, we can think about anniversaries of publications or events. We could think about birthdays of authors. We could think about an older treatment of a theme that is relevant today or sheds light on something that's happening today. We could think about a film or a television adaptation or perhaps a local performance. All these things can serve as occasions for a piece of public scholarship on the internet. So for instance, Dan Brown's brother, you may not know, is a composer. It's actually a very good one. And he wrote a sacred mass using Charles Darwin's words from The Origin of Species. And this was performed in Victoria and nearby Vancouver. And when I realized that was coming, I kind of wrote a piece about that. The other thing we could realize is that literary research has made us experts to some degree in adjacent fields. So think a little bit about what period or cultural history do you know something about? For me, that was 19th and 20th century Christian fundamentalist theology, but also history and politics to a degree as well. So those are the kinds of things that I write about in my public scholarship. I've taken an interest in what we might call fundamentalist epistemology, especially in politics. And this is me responding to Kurt Anderson's Fantasyland, which in an excerpt, Anderson argued that the sort of turn toward alternative facts among the conservative Christian right today was prompted by postmodern academics. And I sort of respond to him here and say, there's not really very much sign that that's actually occurred. Public scholarship is scholarly because it is research-based. You know, journalists do research as well, obviously, for the purpose of investigation and reporting. I think what distinguishes public scholarship, in my mind, is that it is often work based on years of research into one's disciplinary field, most of which is not ever going to be communicated to the public. This is another example, given my background, on how we could understand the ability of conservative Christians to dissemble. In another example, I talked, and Rosemary mentioned this, I talked about how fake news consumption during the 2016 election cycle seemed to be consumed more by religious conservatives than by liberals or non-religious folks. And the explanation I suggested here is that for 100 years, conservative white Christians have nurtured a kind of skepticism toward mainstream institutions such as universities and journalism that established and circulated expert knowledge. But beyond this, they had also built up a network of institutions of what we might call counter-expertise and a kind of alternative information ecosystem that has made them more vulnerable to fake news and to conspiracy theories such as QAnon today. In this respect, I think we could think about public scholarship opportunities not as starting from scratch on a new research question, but rather as shaping into a very small form an idea that you happen to know from your years of research experience. Another example for me was why pointing out hypocrisy no longer has the sting that it once did. Apologies in my title to Bruno Latour. Evangelicals, for instance, were very critical of Bill Clinton's extramarital affairs in the 1990s, but that didn't seem to bother them about the new president. So I tried to address what has happened to the critique of hypocrisy. So just to conclude here, I still use public scholarship for self-promotion or project promotion purposes. I edited a special issue of Christianity and Literature on the topic of literature about the Christian right. And then I wrote this public piece talking about it and talking about the issue and highlighting all the individual articles. And this was basically a form of publicity for an academic project that I was engaged on. I also had recently published an article on the evangelical novel The Shack in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion on how the novel had inadvertently rediscovered ancient Israelite polytheism. And so I, again, wrote a kind of publicity piece for that. I was sort of charged here with reducing a kind of 17,000 word article into about an 800 word article. So it's simpler, but it is publicity for what I'm talking about. So does public scholarship in literary studies work? I don't really know the answer to that. This is the dashboard of the conversation, which I've been talking about, and the 3 articles I've written for the conversation seems to have garnered 113,000 readers, which is much more than I'm used to as an academic author. But for some reason, my book is still not a bestseller. I'll just stop and say that I think there are professional reasons as well for the public humanities and literary studies. It's my hope that through civic engagement and communication, public scholarship has a role to play in strengthening democracy and human rights. Public scholarship can encourage wider audiences to consider themselves as stakeholders of what we do as humanists. After a recent public lecture, for example, an audience member in a STEM-related profession came up to me to express surprise at my use of the word research to describe my investigation of how literature was responding to the age of the Christian right. So if the public is not used to thinking of literary studies as a research activity, let alone one that illuminates the deepest questions of who we are and how we should live, I hope that public scholarship can help advance our discipline's visibility and its reputation. This is no less true for colleagues in other fields across our campuses and for our university administrators, I might add, who may believe that what we do in English departments is just read books, but they learn otherwise when they stumble across our public scholarship, as they might be more likely to do than come across our academic publications in specialist journals. Public scholarship will not save literary studies or humanities, and it will not solve all our crises. But it can be part of a broader move, I hope, to demonstrate the value of humanities to a larger, wider public and a way of gaining trust, but also responding to our mandates as public supported institutions of learning. Thank you so much for having me here today.